Welcome to our next session on Pakistani writings in English. In our earlier discussions, I have tried to talk about in detail the debate surrounding the use of English language as a medium of expression in third world countries. Remember one thing, at this stage in your studies, you're not expected to read a story and then analyze it the way you would at the early stages of your exposure to literature. At this level, you are supposed to be reading around the subject, developing your own sound comprehension of different aspects of the subject, the issues which have already been discussed by writers, and then obviously build on them with your own knowledge and production of ideas. So that was a detailed talk on how English language has been critiqued by post-colonial scholars in the world at large, and then specifically by Pakistani writers. Today I'm going to talk about the criteria on the basis of which we define Pakistani literature in English. See, when we start studying this subject, there are certain writers which are included and some others which are excluded. So here I just want to explain the parameters which we use to measure the relevance of a certain writer or his works to this subject. Which writers and works can be studied under this subject and which cannot be, I'm going to discuss it. Next, I want to talk very briefly about evolution of Pakistani literature, the most prominent and influential writers and some of their seminal works, especially talking about novelists, because initially I want to introduce you to these novelists because in the last 2 centuries novel has maintained its popularity and public reception more than any other genre of literature. Similarly, in Pakistani context, we find novel appearing as a dominant genre of writing. So I'll talk about 2 generations of Pakistani writers, something about Pakistani English novel, and the common themes which have been explored by these writers in their works. And in the end, I want to talk about the issue of representation in Pakistani literature. How Pakistan as a country and society has been portrayed by these writers in the first place, and secondly, and very importantly, how this diasporic status of these major Pakistani writers has affected and interacted with their representation of their native culture. This is, a very complex topic, and I'll try to explain it to a satisfactory extent. So, first of all, let's talk about what is the criteria to define Anglophone Pakistani literature. There are basically two criteria to decide if a work of literature will be qualified and categorized as Pakistani English literature or not. And these are, first of all, ethnicity of the writer, and secondly, the subject matter of the work. Now, let me here guide you about the concept of ethnicity. There are these various terms which in common parlance are used synonymously, but if we look at them closely, we find significant differences between them. So ethnicity, race and nation are usually used interchangeably, as if presupposing their synonymity. But in fact, these three are different from each other. So if you want to read about these three terms and how they differ from each other, I would recommend you to go and read the book Key Concepts in Post-Colonial Studies, which is written by these three writers, Bill Ashcroft, Gareth Griffith and Helen Tiffin. You can easily access this book online. So I'll here focus on what ethnicity is, and by just explaining its basic concept, we'll move on. So ethnicity means the identity that you derive from belonging to a group that has its own distinct cultural or national characteristics. Now, in terms of ethnicity, we have three possibilities in which the writer will be considered a Pakistani writer. The first possibility is that he is living permanently in Pakistan, but he was born somewhere else. So this person, this writer, who was born in some other country, but then, whether his parents migrated to Pakistan, let's say in the times of partition or even after that, and then they settled here in Pakistan. The second possibility is born in Pakistan but currently living somewhere else. And this category is applicable to dozens of Pakistani English writers. who are originally from Pakistan by birth, but after that they migrated to some other country and have been living there for a long period of time. So these are the writers which we usually recognize as diasporic writers. I'll explain what diaspora is and um, I mean how we actually critique and approach the narratives of these writers. This is the last point I have mentioned in my outline of discussion. So we'll talk about it in detail. The third possibility is born in Pakistan but living here. So this is, you can say, the purest possibility to determine a person's Pakistani ethnicity. And in this category you can include somebody like Babsi Sidhwa. But this is one criterion. And the second and equally important criterion is the subject matter of their work. If a writer fulfills any of the three possibilities of ethnicity I have just explained, and his work centers on Pakistani society, their history and culture, that work will be considered worth studying in this course, Pakistani Literature in English. But if either of these two criteria is missing, that work or that writer will not be included in Pakistani Literature in English. Now, in terms of brief history of Pakistani literature, I just want to review a good number of influential Pakistani writers who have contributed to production of literature in English in Pakistan since independence. So for the sake of convenience and on the basis of my own understanding, I divide these writers into two generations. First generation Pakistani writers and then second generation Pakistani writers. So by first generation Pakistani writers, I mean all those writers who contributed to writing in English right after partition. And this category continues till 1980s and 90s. Now if you want to explore more about these writers and their works, I would recommend you to read a Pakistani linguist, Tariq Rahman's book, History of Pakistani Literature in English. And this time span I have mentioned under this category of first generation of Pakistani writers, 1947 to 1988, which you can see in my slide, is actually taken from his book. His book covers literature written in English in Pakistan from 1947 till 1988. So he has talked about the major and some of the minor writers in great detail. So, for the sake of more knowledge about these writers and the kind of literature which was produced in Pakistan during this era, you can always go back and read Tariq Rahman's book. It is easily available in the market and a work of extensive, mature scholarship. Now, for the sake of introduction, I just want to mention these three most prominent Pakistani writers in this category. Ahmad Ali, who received international acclaim and critical recognition with the publication of his novel Twilight in Delhi, that centers around the decline of the Muslims in the subcontinent and how an atmosphere of pathos prevails around them after they are absolutely vanquished and conquered by the British. Second, we have Zulfikar was a novelist and a poet. He is very well known for his novel The Murder of Aziz Khan. And then I think the writer who remained in Pakistan, spent most of her life in the country and kept writing during these 70s, 80s and 90s, and was and is internationally recognized as Babsi Sidwa. So she produced many works of fiction, including novel and short stories. Some of his novels are The Bride, that talks about the tragic story of a girl who is separated from his parents at the time of partition, adopted by a man, raised by him and then married into northern areas, tribal areas, where her marriage does not work out well, and then the story continues. So these are the three writers which I wanted to talk about in this first category, first generation of Pakistani writers. But apart from that, I just want to add one thing to end this explanation of literature by first generation Pakistani writers, that we, apart from fiction, do have a good amount of solid poetry written by some of Pakistani writers, among whom we have Zulfikar Bose, Tafiq Rafat and some others. But for me, what is more important, and I'll discuss how and on what grounds, is the works of second generation Pakistani writers. And I have just outlined very few of them, because there is a big list of these writers who have written in English after 90s, and especially after 9/11, Pakistani literature has secured solid critical recognition on international scene. So among these second generation Pakistani writers, we have Mohsin Hamid, Kamil Shamsi, Uzma Aslam Khan, Nadeem Aslam, Muhammad Hanif, Moni Mohsin, Tahmina Durrani, Fatima Bhutto and many others. Now, as I said, that the works of these second generation Pakistani writers, in my opinion, are more important for a student studying English literature in Pakistani context, can be justified in multiple ways. First of all, if you look at the artistic accomplishment of these two generations, although it is just a rough comparison, I do not want to somehow place second generation Pakistani writers superior to the first generation writers. I just want to explain a few differences, and these differences, in my opinion, are important to be recognized and understood by a reader of Pakistani literature in English. So, first of all, Pakistani literature in the hands of these second generation writers seems to have matured, and there has been a lot of experimentation with language, form, structure, narratology. They have actually produced literature which can be compared to literature coming from great writers of any part of the world. Although sometimes Pakistani native readers do have their doubts about the literary accomplishment of these writers, and especially about the kind of representation Pakistan has been offered in their works, but that is an issue I want to discuss separately and in satisfactory detail. Second reason for considering them very important is the element of contemporaneity in their works. See, for a person living in Pakistan in 21st century, the literature which was produced by Ahmad Ali, Zulfikar Ghaus and Babsi Sidhwa is not directly immediately relevant, and this is due to a substantial transformation, metamorphosis which happened in the world after and as a result of 9/11. If you read criticism around the event of 9/11 and what kind of literature was produced afterwards, you will see the critics talking about a huge change taking place in the sensibility of writers towards their narratives and choice of their subject matter. This was not merely a change that shaped the politics of the world, but at the same time it affected and changed the perception of literary scholars as well. So the kind of issues which we find in second generation Pakistani writers, in my understanding, need to be understood by a reader of Pakistani literature in English. And during the course of our discussions, we'll certainly be analyzing in detail some of the seminal works produced by some of these writers. Obviously, not all of them. So, next, Let's look at the common themes which we find in Pakistani literature in general. See, Pakistani novel, especially as I have just mentioned, the way it is written after 9/11 is sometimes referred to as historical fiction. And the reason is these writers have been preoccupied with the past of the country, the past of the nation. And it seems as if they believe history is not a matter of past. It is strongly connected with your present and shapes the way you actually look towards the future. So there is this strong awareness and realization of the importance of history in the works of these second generation Pakistani writers. So they have talked about the most important and transformative moments and events in the history of Pakistan and how we have reacted to them as a nation. There is one more thing I should be explaining here for the sake of your understanding. When you read these works, you will find, and I'll explain some of these ideas in some detail, the writers, while dealing with the history of the country, seem to suggest that there have been certain wrongs committed by us as a nation which need to be realized, acknowledged and rectified. So they have adopted this revisionist approach towards the history of Pakistan. You cannot simply overlook the past and whatever errors which you have made and then somehow survive very easily and with a clear conscience. Their argument seems that, and there is substantial evidence to strengthen this viewpoint, this angle of looking at things. History in Pakistan has not been written without prejudice or partiality. It contains a lot of pitfalls, a lot of flaws, a lot of omissions. Let me explain what I mean by omissions. The kind of history that is official mainstream history being taught in our education system in schools and colleges and being circulated in our publishing industry has its own drawbacks. This history actually leaves out a few important aspects of different historical events of our past. some perspectives, although they were based on veracity and truthfulness, have been abandoned. They have been silenced or marginalized, given less space in the historiography, writing of history. So, this is the main idea that I just wanted to explain with reference to Pakistani historical fiction and how these writers have actually responded to writing of history in the country. And it means history has been manipulated by the establishment and certain political forces for their own advantages. And as we read these narratives, as readers of literature, we are expected to be approaching things with an open mindedness, trying to accept a different version of history from the one that we are already familiar with. Because when we study literature, a student is not dealing with a subject that has objective answers. There are always multiple subjective answers to every issue. So what you are expected to do is, as a reader, is to recognize the complexity of the issue instead of oversimplifying these issues for the sake of satisfying certain ulterior agendas of these establishment or political powers. When we go through these discussions, you will be able to understand these ideas better. So I just want to conclude this explanation of what we mean by Pakistani historical fiction and what they have what kind of approach they have adopted in those works. So when I talk about the common themes found in these works, you will be able to understand this framework of ideas, this main approach adopted by these writers even better. Because you will have these works that you can study and then comprehend what kind of approach is being adopted and offered by the writer in a certain narrative. So the common themes which have been treated and explored by these writers are partition, first of all. See, partition is the moment when United India was divided into two territories, two countries, Pakistan and India. Now, this was a very crucial and undeniably sensitive moment in the history of the people of the subcontinent. So partition took place. The country was divided into two countries. Now, at the time of partition, what happened is rewritten by these writers in the form of fiction. So you have basically narration of history in history books, and then you have a kind of narration of history in fiction that offers you an alternative vision, an alternative version of the same historical events, and actually incorporates what was left out by the historians, or it centers what was decentered and marginalized by the historians. So these writers have contributed significantly by rewriting these stories in their works of fiction. So partition was one of the bloodiest events in the history of subcontinent, especially when a large mass migration took place. Millions of people migrated from Pakistan and India. And whatever atrocities were committed by Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs, all the people who were involved, have been explored by these writers, and we'll be looking at some of the works which have briefly touched upon partition as their backdrop of the story. So this partition theme has been explored by writers mainly in two ways. Some of them have focused on the psychological trauma and wounds which were created and left by partition. The people of that generation who were alive at the time of partition still seem to be obsessed with nostalgia, a keen, sad remembrance of their past. They cannot detach themselves from their homeland and the place they left in order to migrate to the other country, and more importantly, the sufferings, miseries, and atrocities they either witnessed or they were actively involved in them. So there was this mob sentiment at rise during the times of partition, clouding people's judgment about right and wrong. It became a brutal battle of survival. And if you want to read the stories of partition, you obviously have dozens of books available on them. And next we have, and let me explain the other aspect of partition talked about by these Pakistani novelists. The first one is the psychological trauma created and left by partition. Some of the writers have focused on the social aftermaths of this partition, how the societies suffered due to this huge change in the very structure of society, the country. They had to construct their country from the very roots. It was a new beginning for both the countries, and you know very well that right after partition, although Pakistan came into being, it was literally very difficult for the people to survive and take care of their families. People who had uh, left India in order to migrate to Pakistan and settle here, to own this land as their homeland, as the land they dreamed of, faced innumerable, unexpected, unforeseen problems and difficulties. First, they had to live in refugee camps and certainly found life too unbearable. And sometimes, you know, uh, there were these unexpected times when they obviously when they had to face the problems they had not anticipated. So survival became absolutely difficult for them. So these writers have talked about the effects this phenomenon of partition created in both societies. Next, we have probably the most pathetic, the most painful event in the history of Pakistan, that is 1971 Civil War, in which Pakistan was, you know, unable to survive as one unity. East Pakistan was separated, and after this conflict emerged as a different, separate, independent country with the name Bangladesh. So, some of the writers have talked about the involvement of politicians and dictators of the country to cause this huge wound in the consciousness of the nation. And you know, at the same time, the conflict with India also escalated, and we had around 90,000 soldiers captured by India at that time. And it was, you know, the most humiliating experience in the history of the nation. And you know, the country was still struggling to somehow uniform itself and start making progress. So this 1971 incident has been explored by many writers like Moni Mohsin in her novel The End of Innocence uses this conflict in the narrative, where the conflict starts and the threat with India follows, and then obviously the country goes bonkers. And significantly, another writer, Kamila Shamsi, has also explored the same theme in his novel Cartography. Since we are not going to talk in detail about these two narratives, I just wanted to discuss them, just reference them, so that if some of you are interested to read about this 1971 Civil War treatment in Pakistani fiction, you can consult these works and read them for your understanding. Third, we have Dictatorship of General Ziaul Haq. And obviously, the Afghan Soviet War, in which Pakistan became an ally of the Americans, supported their political agendas, and in collaboration with CIA, Pakistan's involvement in this war has been the root cause of many daunting and uncontrollable problems Pakistan has suffered in the coming decades. So Zia's regime again signals the interruption of democracy in the country, and how the country has been negatively affected by the military presence. See, these dictators have manipulated their power for their own purposes. And you will find an elaborate account of Zia's regime as explored in a work of fiction in Muhammad Hanif's novel A Case of Exploding Mangoes. So you can read that narrative and you will find the most objectionable aspects which the people, the scholars, the critics have found with Zia's regime, especially the way he tried to Islamize the country and its constitution, but in fact used this Islamization as a pretext to strengthen his rule and maintain it for the people of the country. Since the majority of the country are Muslims, and they had these problems with dictatorship, and they certainly disliked it and did not support it. So after coming into power, after appropriating power from Bhutto and hanging him, Zia wanted to secure his position as a dictator. So he used these tactics to ensure maintenance of power and its continuity for a certain period of time. And how a dictatorship was used by the international powers, especially, let's be very direct, American foreign policy. They at that time wanted to weaken the superpower at that time, that is the Soviet Union, and they were fighting this war in Afghanistan, and with the help of Pakistan, they supported the soldiers from within Afghanistan, and then obviously trained people to go there and fight against the Soviets. And ultimately, they succeeded in their attempt to banish the Soviets as defeated power from Afghanistan. And yes, if you want to uh, read about the treatment of Afghan Soviet war, although it has not been uh, dealt with in great detail in a work of fiction by Pakistani writers, at least I cannot recall any for the time being. But yes, there are these references, significant references towards this war being fought in Afghanistan in Kamila Shamsi's novel Burnt Shadows. Let's move on to the next theme, that is nuclear standoffs with India. I do not need to discuss it in great detail because this is again connected with the same themes as we have this conflict, perpetual conflict with our neighbor country for the last 7 8 decades since after Pakistan's creation. So it has, I mean, our relationship with India has been a very troublesome one, and it has actually caused us and cost us a lot of trouble. We have it has consumed a lot of our revenue and energy, and very poignantly, painfully speaking, it has been manipulated by both the countries for their own political purposes, to sustain themselves and strengthen their power in the country. They have exploited this anti-India or anti-Pakistan sentiment and gained people's vote by highlighting their strategies they will be adopting to empower their country against their arch enemy, especially. And this is not to be biased, actually. If you read the history of Pakistan and India, especially the way politicians have dealt with this relationship with the other country, you will find that in India there has been greater prejudice against the Pakistanis, especially some of their political parties have exploited this very idea to empower themselves and expand their vote bank. Especially if you want to read about it, you should study the Indian writer Arundhati Roy's fiction and prose, and you will see how this BJP especially has been using this prejudice, this enmity against Pakistan as a political tool to gain people's good opinion and strengthen themselves in politics against their adversaries and rival parties. In the end, we have the most, if not most, at least very important uh, theme of 9/11 attacks and the way it affected the world politics across the world. I mean, it did not affect one country only or two countries, it affected the whole world. And then, especially, how this 9/11 affected the Muslims in general and Pakistanis in particular. So, this, as I have already mentioned, 9/11 is a significant turn in the history of mankind in modern day world, after which the politics of the world changed substantially. So these writers have actually tried to see how this 9/11 led to Islamophobia and how it was related to issues of terrorism and fundamentalism in Muslim countries and the world at large. So I'm not explaining this idea in detail because this is going to be one of our topics I'll be elaborating on in my upcoming discussions. So let me stop here and ask all of you to follow these discussions very attentively in order to develop your own comprehension of these issues. And I believe some of these ideas will be very useful to you when you would be trying to write something on Pakistani literature. And if you have any questions regarding this discussion, you can obviously contact me anytime. So that's it for today. Thank you very much. See you in the next discussion. Allah Hafiz.